Hi everyone, this is chapter 15, Designing Qualitative Research. We'll be continuing from the last chapter, chapter 14, Introduction to Qualitative Research, and we'll build on the information and insights that we have gathered from that chapter. In this chapter, we'll be breaking it into two halves. So in this recording, there will be just the first half of chapter 15, and then in a separate recording, we will have the second half of the remainder of this chapter. But overall, for chapter 15, we are interested to discuss the role of the qualitative researcher. What is the role and involvement of the qualitative researcher in his or her study? We'll be looking at selecting the most appropriate approach or the most appropriate form of involvement for the qualitative researcher as part of the design of the projects that he or she wants to work on. We'll be discussing a little bit as well as sampling strategies in this first half of the chapter. And then we'll save the rest of this chapter in a separate lecture. In qualitative research, the qualitative researcher assumes the role of the observer or the interviewer, and that is generally true. So generally, the qualitative researcher will either be an observer or an interviewer, but also the qualitative researcher can be both, can sometimes apply both observing roles as well as interviewing roles. So we'll expand on those aspects, the observing roles. There are 4 different types that we'll look at in today's lecture, and a little bit about the interviewing aspect of collecting qualitative data. So we can see that from qualitative research, the researcher takes on a very hands-on approach. The researcher is part of the whole process from start to end. It's not just from the research problem that the researcher thinks about as the researcher go visits the scholarly literature to create the research questions and then designing and constructing the research design. But the researcher is also hands-on because he or she is part of the data collection and the data analysis. But before we get into the analysis aspect, which is not quite the focus of today's chapter, we're more interested in after the research design and as the researcher goes out into the world or into the natural setting or environment to collect data, what is the researcher's role? Okay. So it can be some form of participation and observation, and as I alluded earlier, there are 4 different kinds of participation and observation roles that the qualitative researcher might partake. So we'll save that in a future slide that we'll visit in a few moments. Ultimately, qualitative research, as we have looked at in chapter 14, we are interested in specific instances in the real environment, real settings, involving real interactants, the way they behave or talk to each other, communicate with one another in the natural setting. So for instance, say conversations between a parent and the parent's children. So parents and children, they exist in a lot of natural environments. They can be at the playground, they can be at school, or they might be at a family member's house, but usually it'll most probably be their own nuclear family home. What are the skills that a qualitative researcher must have? He or she must possess some strong theoretical knowledge or insight of the literature. So we know that from previous chapter 14, we know that qualitative research is not truly or very rigorously or rigidly rather, not rigidly linear. It is not something that from start to end we plan and we cannot backtrack. We know that there's a lot of back and forth. The researcher can backtrack, can revisit scholarship or literature that he or she might have missed, or perhaps a colleague a colleague mentions that maybe there's something else that he or she should read, the qualitative researcher might also revise or change the research questions. So we know that the entire procedure, the process, there's a lot of back and forth. There can be a lot of revisions here and there. But the key thing for us to note is that in order for the qualitative researcher to make those kinds of revisions, whether it's big, huge revisions or very minute, more fine-tuning kind of revisions, the researcher must be aware of the theoretical knowledge or literature that's been written on that topic, on that context. It's only because of that savvy insight knowledge that the researcher has that he or she is able to tweak the design and the research questions appropriately to answer the research problem that the researcher had to want to ask or to explore to understand. The researcher must also have some kind of sensitivity. It's highly important that the researcher understands the dynamic that he or she is entering into so that the researcher knows how to be respectful of the people that he is interviewing or that he or she is observing, but also very importantly that the researcher knows how to guide how to interview or to bring out those voices from those participants, to hear what those participants have to share, their views, their desires, their opinions about things that interest the researcher. The researcher must be able to recognize that he or she plays a huge hands-on role in the research experience. And by that we mean the process of developing the research problem, data collection, analysis, and then eventually sharing of those findings. So a recognition that the researcher brings his or her own biases, his or her own way of viewing the world, scholarly interests, practical interests, and things like that. The researcher brings all of that into the mix of processing, conducting the research, and making sense of what the researcher learns in that process. The qualitative researcher must also be good at big picture thinking. In terms of what we mean by big picture thinking is that the qualitative researcher can see abstract ideas, things that don't necessarily seem to make a lot of connections initially. Okay, for most people, or generally when we don't draw those connections or conclusions, the qualitative researcher has that innate ability to see that, maybe if I can pull this concept from here over here in this corner, and then if I connect it with this other concept over there, maybe something interesting might come out of that interaction. Who knows? Give it a try. So the qualitative researchers can see things abstractly, able to connect diverse different concepts and then see some kind of connection between them, and connecting those new conceptual thinking of models and connecting it to make sense of the data that he or she wants to collect and to analyze. So the qualitative researcher in general is someone who is very big picture, very broad, thinks about things in quite a broad fashion, quite unlike the way a traditional quantitative researcher would think about life in general, as well as how the quantitative researcher will conduct his or her work. Alright, 2 slides ago we alluded to the participation and observations that a qualitative researcher can participate in. So there are 4 different forms and we'll look at them in turn. So firstly, there is the complete participant. So what do we mean by the complete participant? We mean that the researcher embeds him or herself in that context. So the researcher is part of that context, is already part of that community or that group, and then the researcher collects data by way of observing what's going on. The researcher doesn't have to gain access to it because the researcher is already part of that group. So for instance, say you're interested to learn about the family dynamics of your own family. Perhaps you come from a family where there are immigrants from different countries, and some of them are first generation American, maybe second generation Americans, and so we see that there's a lot of different influx of different cultural influences, not just generational, but from just being, say, raised in Texas or in the US, and as compared to another family member who might be raised in a different country, and as opposed to, say, another family member who was born in country A, raised in country B, and now in the US. So those complexities are pretty interesting to observe and to study. But as a complete participant, you're already part of that context, or you're already part of that family. You don't need to gain new access to it. You don't need people's permission because you're already part of it. But the distinction about the complete participant is that the complete participant does not disclose his or her researcher's role. That means to say the other people who are in that context, they see that person as one of them. So like the example I gave you, say you want to study family dynamics in your own family. Oh, everyone already knows who you are. You are the sister in this family, or you are the brother, you are the father, or you are the grandparent. So everyone knows who you are already in that family, how you relate to everyone else, but no one knows that you are actually a researcher trying to study the dynamics. So that is kind of like an undercover kind of thing, kind of interesting. It's undercover. The researcher doesn't expose or reveal his or her researcher's role. So that's complete participant. You can imagine that there is value in this form. For example, let's say you want to do another study on, say, gangs, for instance. Of course, if you want to study gangs, you can't just go to a gang and say, hey, I want to join you guys for 3 months and see what you guys are up to. Well, no gang is going to let you in, I'm pretty sure, if that is your purpose. So you might want to be an undercover. So this form of participant observation has its value, is kind of interesting too, but it becomes more practical, or we can appreciate its value as we look at the other three. So let's move on to number 2, which is participant as observer. This is the second form of participant observation. This form of participation, the researcher is also a participant, but this time around the researcher reviews his or her research role. So this researcher is still part of that community. No need to gain new permission or access to that community, but this time the researcher lets people know in that context that he or she actually is also observing other people and has a researcher role, because the person is not just part of that context naturally because he or she is already a member of, but also that individual, that researcher, is doing a research in studying how people around him or her, as well as in that context, behave and interact. So we see the distinction between this second form of participant observation in comparison to the first one that we talked about. Okay, so now we move to the third kind, which is the observer as participant. So what is a observer as participant form? This form of research participation is where the researcher's role is well established. So the context, the people in the environment, they know that this person is a researcher, so similar to this form right here, the second one. But the distinction here this time around is that the researcher actually needs to gain permission or needs to gain access to that context or environment. For instance, say you want to learn about your best friend Joey's family, how family dynamics happened in your best friend Joey's family. Now, suppose you are not part of that family either by marriage or by blood. So you might be a best friend, but then a best friend probably don't hang out in that place all the time. But if we're interested to do this study of our best friend Joey, what we might do is to get their experience, their permission. So they, as in Joey as well as his family, their permission for us to be part of their daily lives and to observe them. So we can then be an observer as participant because we don't naturally always hang out at Joey's home. But now that Joey says that's fine, you guys can come visit. So I'll be there. I'll participate as like one of them, so maybe I'll play board games with the kids, for example, or I might help out with preparing the meals in the kitchen. That's another example. So I will still be participating, but really they understand that I am a researcher who is trying to observe. I'm spending most of my energy observing those interactions at Joey's home. All right, so that is the third kind of participant observation, and we move on to the fourth type, which is the complete observer. The complete observer can either be someone that's well acknowledged to be not a participant, but there just to observe. So for example, let's say I'm observing people in the cafeteria and I make it clear that I'm not there to eat or to socialize or to just chill, but I'm really just there watching people. So there can be a complete observer, or the complete observer can be someone that is unknown or unseen by everyone else in that environment. So the complete observer is just watching them, maybe from a video camera, for instance. So the complete observer is completely outside of those interactions, but is watching and learning about those dynamics in that environment. So then we have the four forms of participant observation. Each of them are a little bit different. So obviously the first two are more similar and the next two are more similar to each other. But we also know that these two right here, the second and third forms, can be similar in the way that the people that the researcher is observing knows, the people actually know that the researcher is watching them. Okay, so another way for us to think about the researcher's role in participant observation is this way of talking about community membership. So the community membership, there are three levels. So the researcher could be, again, observing people based on the researcher's peripheral membership. So one way might be, say, the waiter or waitress at a restaurant. Okay, the waiter or waitress is working there, so it's really naturally existing in that context, doesn't need to gain new access, but the waiter or waitress is using that peripheral membership to observe family dynamics. So maybe say families go there for lunch or for dinner. So as the person comes in and brings in the food and serves the family, the waiter or waitress is a peripheral member in that environment as an employee of that organization or that venue and gets to observe that family, how they behave. An active membership means that, again, the researcher doesn't have to gain new access to the environment, but the researcher is already part of that interaction or activities in that context. So the researcher is actively involved. However, the researcher also refrains from making a full commitment to the goals and values of the other participants. So kind of doing what everyone else is doing, but not fully committed, because part of the energy of existing there is to be spent on observing the interactions of the interactants of interest. Next, we have the complete members, and this form of research data collection is done in settings to collect data where the researcher is again already part of that that organization is already having full membership in that context environment and just being who he or she is. So one way that we can talk about it is again back to the complete participation role, where you're already part of the family. You don't have to gain new access to it, don't need people's permission to be there. You are already a full member of that environment, that context, that setting, and you're just being who you are, acting the way you have always been, and just collecting data that way. So we always talk about collecting data. Data, as we've talked about in chapter 14 and definitely at the second half of chapter 15, we'll talk about, we'll revisit the idea of what qualitative data means, and what qualitative data can look like for the purposes of qualitative research. So in essence, we can look at qualitative participant observation in these ways, as well as in terms of the membership level of the researcher. Of course, the researcher can also conduct research using interviews, can be one-on-one interviews, or can be two-on-one, two research to one participant. So interviews can involve, say, structured interviews. So there's a certain protocol, a set of interview questions that the researcher has pre-planned, or it can be more of a semi-structured, meaning to say there might be just a few questions to get things started, but then the researcher starts to ask follow-up questions depending on how the interviewee responds. So do we, as qualitative researchers, do we have the ability to move among these research roles, the ones that we looked at on the previous slide? The answer is yes, we do have that ability to move around. In fact, it might actually be a good design to do that, because then we get to collect different forms of data, and by collecting different sources and different forms of data, we can then triangulate them, which is a powerful way to establish credibility, which we have discussed in chapter 14. So how do we identify the research focus of a project to do? Firstly, I think this is an important point, is that the research question that the researcher wants to pursue should be personally interesting and or compelling. So think about this, the researcher is typically the first audience of that research project, and it must be something that intrigues that researcher to not just say, hey, this is interesting, I want to study this thing, but ultimately to follow through the whole process of designing the project, collect data, and then analyzing, synthesizing what he or she learns. Think about things in your life too. What are the most intriguing things or questions in your life that you are trying to understand or to find answers for? So those are good ideas, are good places to start. Something that truly intrigues you, because at the end of the day, if you can find that answer that really truly intrigues you, that makes you want to find out the answer, then that process is very satisfying, and by itself that process is very gratifying, and it makes people, well, at least makes yourself feel satisfied, content, and happy. Should be contextually bound. Remember that qualitative research uses the inductive approach, so we move from the specific to the general. So when we are specific, we are very contextually bound, very specific to, say, a time, a location, type of population, so specific demographic description, if there are any, and those sort of things. And each project, because it's so contextually bound and because it's so driven by the curiosity of the researcher, it's quite likely that the design will also be very unique. Meaning to say, the design for one project to the other can look quite different, and even by different researchers on pretty similar context or questions. it's a good idea that researcher develop a purpose statement, so something as a roadmap, just a general broad guide like the research problem, something that's broad, there's a big picture, abstract, to have some kind of direction, to say that this is kind of where we're headed, not exactly how it should look like pinpoint exactly what it will be, but just broadly, this is a direction we are going towards that we want to explore, so that to allow the researcher a broad flexibility to not only have a direction to go towards, but also that flexibility as we explore, as we find there are new other interesting elements, we can spend time to learn more about those little interesting nuances. Again, the researcher should be familiar with the literature. By being familiar with literature, the researcher knows how to adjust the research questions, know how to adjust the design to suit the specific direction or the broad direction that the researcher wants to pursue. The researcher can, because of his or her deep knowledge of the literature, would have access or knowledge about the appropriate theories that can be used to shed light on the project. And also because it allows researcher to know what kind of research methods or techniques are out there and could be appropriate for application. The conceptual map, there is no right or wrong, good or bad way of doing it. It's really what makes sense and what helps the researcher most. It's a visual representation, so it can be just very much just a sketch, very just brief and very little details, or it can be very detailed, highly detailed with lots of information. No right or wrong, no good or bad. You have a few examples that is available in the chapter in this chapter on page 266. You can see that there is different forms, different ways of presenting them, but they are all just visual representations or visual layouts, just to guide us. Sometimes when we have it all on a piece of paper, when it's visual, we might be able to see some connections that we didn't think about previously, or we realize that what we actually know is not quite adequate or just too fuzzy. So by drawing it out, by putting it on a visual format, it helps us to see those pictures, see those concepts visually. We can then have the ability to group them if necessary, try to draw connections and relationships with them, among them, and then perhaps we can see more clearly how those concepts differ and the boundaries that set them apart. It helps the process of doing concept maps. The process helps us to be a little bit more creative, because it's not just all in the head, but we can try and we can then see it visually. And by putting it on a piece of paper visually, when we have a group of people looking at it, we can then see it from multiple different angles from each of our own perspectives, and that helps to shape, to strengthen the connections, or to broaden the approach that the researchers might want to take. Qualitative research, unlike quantitative research, is big on description and explanations. Description being to say we want to explain, we want to use the specific instance to shed light on what it means about something that we study in the broader context. So for instance, my own research, I study nurses' behavior and their interactions among one another. I use specific instances to study their interactions, and then I broaden to theorize. Now if it happens for this group of nurses, perhaps those dynamics are true and applicable to nurses in other locations and settings. And so we study, or I study it from a very specific instance and then broaden it out to the general nursing population. The research questions can be part of a group of questions, or it can be just one guiding question. Again, it depends on the complexity of the study, or depending on how nuanced the researcher wants to approach the work. Driven by some kind of purpose objective, which is, as we mentioned before, something that is personally intriguing and sets out the researcher's curiosity to find the answer. Is connected to some kind of context, is contextually bound. And always remember, qualitative research questions are almost always tentative, meaning to say the researcher can always come back and tweak and revise it based on new things that the researcher identifies or sees as the researcher enters into that context of study, or perhaps new scholarship that emerged or are published, new research that has been published, and during the time the researcher conducts a study and thought that it's useful to incorporate those findings. So it's tentative. Those research questions can be very tentative. All right. A few ways that qualitative researchers might apply sampling techniques, and we talk about this in chapter 6, but here's a quick recap of the more common types of sampling that qualitative researchers use. So the first type is the snowball sampling, also known as the network sampling. Snowball sampling is where the researcher taps into the participants who are already part of the study, and then because the participants may know other individuals who may have the similar characteristics that the researcher is interested in, may refer those individuals to the researcher. So the snowball sampling, or also known as the network sampling, is a way where the researcher taps into the participants' networks. Purposeful sampling is whereby the researcher seeks out individuals who meet certain criteria. So again, perhaps I'm interested to study Vietnam veterans, and so I know someone who is a Vietnam vet. He's my neighbor, and I might ask him to connect me with other Vietnam vets, which will be a snowball sampling. But ultimately, primarily, it's very purposeful because I'm interested only with people who meet that criteria, which is they fought during Vietnam War. Next, another common way that qualitative researchers do their sampling, less common than snowball and purposeful, is the maximum variation sampling. This is less common, but also among the more common types. So the maximum variation sampling is whereby the researcher tries to gain as broad data as he or she can of all the voices that he or she can gather. So for instance, say the researcher is interested in political communication or political rhetoric of President Trump. So the researcher cannot be biased, of course, but the researcher has to gather all possible views. So the researcher has to seek out people who completely love President Trump. So there's on one end, and then on the other end, people who completely hate President Trump. So we have the two extremes, those who love him and those who hate him. So that is what maximum variation means. We gather people from one side of the camp, which is people who love President Trump, and then all the way along that continuum to the middle, where some people might, I don't really care, I don't really think this way or that way, and then all the way to the other end of the spectrum of people who completely hate President Trump. So by collecting and sampling voices from the entire continuum, the researcher gets to tap into all the different voices, possible voices, pros and cons, good and bad, different views and different comments about President Trump. So more broadly, this sampling technique allows us to hear pretty much everything, the good, bad, and ugly, about something that the researcher wants to study. And the researcher continues to tap into that whole continuum from one end of the extreme to the other, until the researcher exhausts all possible responses or views from each of those extremes as well as those in the middle. So these three types of sampling techniques, more or less the most common type in qualitative research, but definitely the first two are the more common types. So we'll take a break here for chapter 15, and then in the next set of recording we'll pick up on where we left off and finish up the last half of chapter 15.